Bon, bonjour à toutes et à tous, merci d'être là. Je remercie le laboratoire d'Histoire des théories linguistiques que fait aujourd'hui, sa directrice Madame Gondeux, et évidemment le professeur Zwartjes qui a accepté de présenter son travail. Donc, c'est son dernier livre qui nous réunit aujourd'hui, du laboratoire, des participants au projet ChEDiL et d'autres collègues. Et je vais aussi remercier les collègues qui ont eu possible organiser cette matinée, dont Martin Rousseau, qui fait partie avec le professeur d'artiste Rosalia, aussi du projet ChEDiL, comme membre de l'histoire. Alors, juste deux mots sur ce projet, ceux qui ne le connaissent pas, c'est le PRC, donc le projet de recherche collaborative financé par la ANR ChEDiL, c'est l'acronyme des titres anglais, de ma français, donc c'est Dictionnaires sino-européennes, manuscrits lexicographiques pour l'étude historique des échanges entre la Chine et l'Europe. Donc, c'est un projet qui porte, d'une façon très simple, va étudier des dictionnaires faits par des Occidentaux, essentiellement, en Chine ou en Europe. Les Chinois et la langue cible, la langue source, et ces dictionnaires sont des manuscrits élaborés entre 1600 et le début du XIXe siècle. Donc, c'est évident que la linguistique missionnaire occupe une place très importante dans cette étude. Et aujourd'hui, nous avons le plaisir d'avoir un des plus importants spécialistes du sujet, donc professeur Zwartjes, qui après une carrière que j'ai vue avait commencé avec des traductions hispano-arabes sur la poésie hispano-arabe, s'est consacré complètement à cette discipline. Donc, il a commencé sa carrière en Norvège, en Hollande. Et après, il y a une petite dizaine d'années, il est arrivé ici à Paris, ce qui était à l'époque Paris 7, je crois, ça s'appelait comme ça, l'université. Alors, je mentionne juste les travaux en cours récents. Donc, il y a, avec notre collègue, peut-être là ce matin, Madame Rebecca Fernandez Rodriguez, l'élaboration d'un handbook d'histoire descriptive linguistique. Il est en train de compléter une étude sur les documents autonomie et sur les ouvrages des missionnaires qui étudiaient cette langue du Mexique. Pour finir, on a le tout récent volume qui est paru cet été, Missionary Grammar and Dictionary of Chinese, Contributions 7th Spanish Dominicans, et aujourd'hui, donc, nous allons l'écouter pour nous présenter son travail. Et je lui passe la parole et je le remercie déjà pour la carrière. Merci à tous.
Merci for that amable introduction. So my talk is in English. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you, Michela Bussotti. Thank you also, Anne Grandeux of this institution for giving me the opportunity to share my findings with you in this context of HDL and, of course, the ChEDiL project. I also would like to thank Vincent and Camille for the technical assistance, and I'm very happy to share my findings here with you. Officially, we have 2 hours. I think this is a bit much because I don't want to talk all the time. It was also for me very nice to feedback, or maybe you have some questions. And in that case, I would like to propose my book has 2 main sections. The first part is grammar, and the second part is lexicography. So I can imagine that maybe 30-35 minutes can be devoted to the first part, grammars. Maybe a break of 5 minutes, or just if you agree. I think you can load up for the second part, the lexicographical part, and this is also around 35 minutes, I think. We will have enough time, I think, for any questions or feedback. I would be very happy to share my findings, but of course there's a lot of speculation in this book because we are talking over many texts, undated, anonymous, and in that case we are never 100% or not always 100% sure about the real data, authorship, etc., and the relations between the texts. I was very happy to see the main objectives of this magnificent project, and it had apparently a nice overlap of many research questions I had also that started already 15 years ago, more or less. And this is what I'm going to present. I have some research questions. I have a general introduction first, and then I will introduce the research questions linked to grammar. Then next, the lexicographical part, and at the end, I will come back to the research questions from the beginning. Before I start, I must say that this book could never be completed without the very skilled professional assistance by Michaela Bussotti, by South Coblin, and Henning Kleuter, Rosario Gianninotto, and Paolo de Troia, and I hope I will not forget, of course, Emanuele Raini, who all helped me so very well with microscopical precision in order to avoid some blunders in my rendering of Chinese characters and romanizations or pinyin. Of course, any mistake, I will be responsible for that, of course. But I must say this before. So this is my title in French, La plus ancienne source connue à ce jour, but I must be a bit more precise, talking about Dominicans, scriptures in Spanish, about Mandarin, and of course it is not plus ancienne because we have already had in the Philippines some documents which are published earlier or earlier, and those studies are already known through the monograph study of Henning Kleuter. That's around 1620. My sources started around 1641. So here is the first step. Actually, my fascination about those texts emerged from a long period about unbelievable stories. And this means within the field of missionary linguistics, we see really unbelievable stories, talking about biographies and bibliographies, and also how information was diffused in Europe. This book focused on a manuscript, March 696, once owned by Leiden Arabist Jacob van Gogh. And I found this source by coincidence because I was working in those days on text from Damascus. It was the colloquial variety of Arabic, and the Arabic had also dictionaries, and those dictionaries were partly based on the text of Jacob Golius. Together with Erpenius, those two Arabists who worked at Leiden University, in particular, Jacob had a big collection of manuscripts, mainly Arabic, but also Persian. He was a mathematician and he knew about China. And in his catalog, there were also some Chinese texts. And many texts disappeared later. And what today is called March 696, that belonged to the Golius collection. And it disappeared. It was bought in Ireland, and today it is in Oxford. It is an anonymous text, undated, and it is called a dictionary. But to my big surprise, the end has an appendix with the title Arte de Lengua Mandarina. I will come back later to this. So Golius had received this manuscript from the Jesuit Martino Martini. Probably you know him. It's probably the earliest grammar of Mandarin Chinese, which was published in Europe, is the grammar of the Jesuit Martino Martini, who, through a series of very coincidental circumstances, brought this manuscript from the Far East via Batavia, Norway. It is really unbelievable how it came to Europe, to the Low Countries. Since Martini happened to be in the Low Countries by chance, and only for a very short time, during his long journey from China to Rome, this opportunity was seized to benefit from his vast knowledge about China. He collaborated on the famous atlas of Johannes Blau, in my opinion, one of the most impressive scientific and from an aesthetic perspective, most admirable products of humanity, for which he published a supplement and enabling the virtually unknown China to be literally mapped out. And Van Gogh wrote an accompanying text in Dutch, which expounds the Chinese tonal system, probably one of the first to be published in the West. This is what you can see in Dutch in the text written by Golius. Toen in het begin van de leste zomer het gerucht liep dat er in onze schepen uit Oost-Indië gekomen was een man van grote wonderen en ongehoorde wetenschap, die hij in de tijd van veel jaren onder de Chinezen verkregen had. Zo beken ik dat ik grote lust kreeg om hem te zien en hem te spreken, ten einde ik enige volmaakter kennis dan ik had van de Chinese zaken, daar ik sedert lange tijd naar getracht had mocht verkrijgen, en enige smaak en kennissen van deze taal te hebben, waartoe men noodzakelijk door de levendige stem van een ervaren verstand geholpen moest worden, want ik verhoopte dat, zo hij misschien enige tijd overig had, hij lichtelijk enig klein deel daaraf aan mij zou vergunnen. So this is the Dutch text. He heard about someone who maybe could come to the Low Countries. Golius had a lot of questions about China, also based on his knowledge from Persian sources, and he wanted to check or ask those questions to this scholar. And he hoped that he had a little time for him, and those questions were actually all answered by Martino Martini when they met each other. And this was so interesting for Martino Martini. He thought this is such an intelligent man, so much interest in China. So he gave him this, and this is the way, the history of this text, how it came to the Low Countries, and today it is in Oxford. It's unbelievable if you can think about those manuscripts from Manila to Batavia, South Africa to Norway, and then to the Low Countries, and Martini later went to Rome, and then he started again his journey back to China. He almost reached Brazil because there was a problem with thunderstorms, I don't know, he came back to Portugal, and then he arrived in China, where he died. I tell you a bit more about the context of those Dominicans. In this case, we have three names, of course, Francisco Diaz and Morales, and I will tell you a little bit about Francisco Varo. Let's have an idea of how they traveled. Morales first returned to Formosa, Manila. In 1613, he arrived in Macau, from where he intended to travel back to Europe via the westward Portuguese route. He traveled to India, then to Africa, returned to Basra, and from where he continued as a nomad on foot through the desert via Babylon, Aleppo, finally reached Venice in 1643. He traveled on foot from Venice via Bologna to Rome, where he presented the decree against the Chinese rights to Pope Urban. And he did not stay a long time there. He departed for Spain and then back to China via the Atlantic route and the Pacific Ocean, which he did already before. So in sum, it is unbelievable for us. Sometimes we are complaining in the long intercontinental flights, or when I'm in my tallies working and complaining about traveling circumstances. But this is really, according to my view, an unbelievable story. Let's take this journey on foot. For instance, from Veracruz, Mexico to Acapulco. You see the 10,000 meters full. The mountains, of course, you can think that this is a very long walk, but this is not the only walk done by Diaz, Morales, all those who followed him. Here, on foot from Basra, going to Aleppo, maybe this port, I don't know which port, because it could be Latakia, I don't know, but this is just an illustration of the circumstances. And start walking from Venice to Rome, and this is in order to have an idea about the circumstances of those travels. This was Morales. Diaz actually made the journey twice, but he had two visits, two stays, let's say, in mainland China. So he arrived also going through the Canary Islands, then to Cuba, La Habana, from La Habana to Veracruz, and from Veracruz to Acapulco, waiting for the galleon, the Acapulco, which brought him to Manila. From Manila to Taiwan, and from Taiwan, he started his journey in some regions, not only as a Dominican, but a few years earlier, the mission started already together with Franciscans, and he came a bit later than the really earliest one. So it is very difficult to understand. There were persecutions, there were very difficult periods, and initially, one moment in 1638, Father Diaz sought refuge in concealment, but was eventually imprisoned. There he endured torture, starvation, lashings, and other forms of physical and psychological abuse. His captors demanded him to reveal the whereabouts of his deity as a means of salvation. Diaz answered that he really welcomed all those sufferings and torture. They could destroy his body, but never his soul that remained eternal and immortal. That was his response. And ultimately, the decision was made to deport him to Macau. As the others, and shackled and barefoot, Diaz was forced to undertake a torturous march that lasted for 5 days, during which he repeatedly lost consciousness. Upon collapsing, unable to proceed, he was transported on a litter to Funing, and where he remained for 7 days before continuing on a 2-week journey to Fuan, and then he actually suffered a lot of tortures and humiliation when he collapsed, and again his captors dumped him in a garbage can, dragging him forth while his body was moving to and fro and oscillating between consciousness and unconsciousness. He became a spectacle for the local population, who derided him, presuming him to be insane. According to his biographers, Diaz found satisfaction in these adversities, for they allowed him a semblance of his tribulation Jesus Christ himself endured during his Via Dolorosa before his crucifixion. Okay, I will make this part of the story a bit brief. He had 2 stays actually in mainland China, and for us the most important period is the period he stayed in Manila with a Chinese convert with this name. In Spanish it is Joaquin Go. He was a Chinese convert. He was baptized by Jesuits and accompanied Francisco Diaz during his travels. He was a literate, very proficient scholar, also in Mandarin studies. They made, according to our documents, they compiled a dictionary in Manila, not in the main center because it was too crowded and too busy. Joaquin worked a bit outside the city. He preferred to more silent or tranquil context, and there they would have compiled a dictionary and a grammar. Morales, the other name I already mentioned, also would have composed a dictionary and some dictionaries, but until so far those texts are just titles and we don't know the whereabouts of those manuscripts. But it is very interesting to know that I tried to make a kind of reconstruction of this early period, because after Morales and of course Francisco Diaz, we have the text of Francisco Varo. This is a grammarian, lexicographer, missionary, also a Dominican, and the earliest printed xylographical printing of his Arte Lengua Mandarina appears posthumous after his death in 1703, and he compiled also dictionaries, monodirectional, translating from Portuguese to Chinese and from Spanish into Chinese, without any Chinese characters. So Francisco Varo is important because Morales, as I said, crossed the whole Pacific, went twice to Cambodia, where his mission started actually, in Cambodia. Then he returned to that place, went through the desert to Europe. Then he had the second travel, but the second travel he did it together with Francisco Varo. So he arrived for the second time in China, and Francisco Varo arrived for the first time. So this is a bit about the context and the complicated circumstances under which I already showed this walk. Okay, let's go to the content of this book. As you can see, this is the title, and for those who already want to see a bit more information, you can, on the site of the publisher, you find also the table of contents. You can see more specifically, precisely, the topics and the titles of the chapters and the paragraphs which are included in this book. So as I said, the first part of this book, I think it's a good opportunity already to have it circulated a bit so you have an impression about what it is. Grammar, as I already said, the model in this case was a Spanish grammar, Nebrija, and we have a text of Francisco Varo, and it's quite late. It's written at the end of the 17th century and published in 1703, but he refers to his predecessors, his sources of inspiration, not always mentioning their names. In some cases he does. When he talks about the dictionaries, he mentions Francisco Diaz, but in his grammar, he just talks about el arte viejo, the old one. There was an old one. And if it was really the text of Morales or the text of Francisco Diaz, or maybe written by both, I don't know, not for sure, but we have, in this case, this fragment I found in this library, which belonged to the Golius collection, Arte Lengua Mandarina. It is a fragment, it is not a complete grammar. It's only about phonology and the romanization system of Mandarin Chinese. And this is, according to my opinion, completed when they were in Manila, 1640, 1641. And it was already in the Low Countries when Martino Martini met Jacob Golius. So this is 1651, 52. And according to my opinion, this is the earliest fragment. It's not a complete grammar, but we can see in the beginning that it is not only a prologue about phonology, because some dictionaries also start with the prologue, only discussing the romanization system. But in this specific fragment, you find some information by Chinese doesn't have inflections, the nouns do not have inflections, there are no conjugations, no declensions, etc. So this actually introducing other topics outside phonology. And then the manuscript stops, and that's it. But we know much more about this grammar. And I try to make a reconstruction because there is also a dictionary. It's very strange that the same manuscript does not have any reference to the grammar, the Golius manuscript, but there are more manuscripts from the same attributed to Francisco Diaz. I'm talking now about the Berlin Krakow manuscript, Jagiellonsky manuscript, and there you find a lot of references to the arte. So we have a certain idea how this arte looked like. It was before Francisco Varo, and it refers to the grammar. So I try to make a kind of reconstruction, what kind of topics are discussed there. And together with this, the second one, Morales, they also said he would have composed a grammar. And we have a very interesting text, only with the title Manuale, but it has a section called Reglas. And the question was always, is this his grammar or isn't this his grammar? And I found out some observations, some references that actually this was his grammar, because they did not have always the intention or the plan to write a complete grammar of the Chinese language, because to a certain degree, it does not make sense according to their opinion, because they based their framework on Nebrija, talking about declension, the case system, the tenses, etc. So some rules are actually already sufficient. And Francisco Barros says also in his colophon, this was my grammar, but actually I could give even more or even less. It doesn't make sense. Just listen to the native speaker, then you learn the language, because with those rules, maybe 10 rules are already sufficient. You need more tools, and I will talk more about that at the end of this course. The whole Dominican program, I can call it an educational program, maybe not intended to be like that, but we have a lot of material which is not exactly a grammar. It is not a dictionary. They are learning tools which were used in the context of education with a great pedagogical value, and not always grammars. I will come back to this later. I can already say that this is very exceptional, talking about the whole world with Spanish sources describing Quechua, Aymara, or Mexican languages, indigenous languages, because in most cases, of course, there are exceptions, we don't have dialogues, we don't have conversation. There were not so many, there are some sources, but in most cases, we have a grammar and a dictionary and religious texts. And not the material we find in China. And China is not the only one, because in Vietnam, you see among the Jesuits also the same tools. In some manuscripts, you have also word lists, thematically arranged word lists, and also practical expressions. I always say, if you have a grammar of Horatio Carocci, one of the best ever written about Nahuatl, you will not find a phrase like, I don't like this tortilla. And you will see later in this text of Morales, you find actually this kind of examples. It's practical, it's for conversation, acquiring conversation skills. And this makes actually this tradition of Dominican text in China quite different if you compare it, of course, with what happened in Mesoamerica and Latin America and the Philippines. Okay, some research questions before I really go into the details. Here and there, I must be very detailed, because sometimes we find a clue just in the use of one little word or a dot in order to have an impression of the relation between those texts, the connection between the manuscripts, in order to be able to give a certain date or authorships or giving names or possible speculation about the origin of those texts. This is from the project, just a selection. It's much more than this, of course. It has a lot of axes or sub-fields or sub-projects. The role played by Western manuscript dictionaries in the histories of Chinese linguistics and missionary linguistics. The different systems used to transcribe the sounds in Latin letters. I will start with this after a couple of minutes. When I talk about the dictionary, we have a lemma, and we can study dictionaries with its macrostructure, but also microstructure, the lemmatization strategies, how they actually compiled those dictionaries. And I already can say that it is unbelievable thinking again about those circumstances, not at airports or in trains, but under circumstances I already have explained a bit. They made sometimes a word list of 200 words or 400 words. We have dictionaries of 4,000. We have also for 7,000 characters, and we have even 15,000, 20,000, 25, and even until 30, 32, 35,000 lemmas. Talking about this tradition, also in Japan, also Zapotec, anything you can imagine, but in China, mainly in Manila, it is a recently published the Manila, the Santo Tomas manuscript. It's one of the most extended or most complete text about, if I'm not mistaken, 32,000 entries. It's trilingual, Spanish and Hokkien, Southern Min, the variety spoken by the Chinese minority in Manila in those days, and also Mandarin Chinese. And so this is actually very interesting. The lemma can just be one equivalent. It can be, as I will show later, one equivalent with two or three near equivalents or synonyms, which are given after that. But we have also lemmas, which have actually a huge amount of information, compound forms, expressions, and examples, which can be useful in a dictionary. So there is another question, interaction between those traditions, East and West. And within the East, we have, of course, the Western perspective, but there's also a Chinese tradition. And in the beginning, they were not so much aware of that, but in later sources we see references also to Chinese lexicographical works. Grammars did not exist in the Western sense, in that case with declensions, with endings, because the Chinese language is so completely different. But also within the tradition, the Western tradition, descriptive tradition, we see a lot of coincidence or maybe discrepancies also between the Portuguese tradition and the Spanish text. And I will come back to that later as well. Dilemmas again, the junction between dictionaries and grammars. And I already said that in this dictionary, the example I gave was the Berlin, Krakow, or Jagiellonski manuscript, has a lot of references to the arte. In this case, there is a clear link between the two texts. Okay, grammar. This is here an illustration of what I want to tell you. This is the front page 1703. It was considered the earliest Dominican source. It was the one was printed in Canton. It is a bit later than Martino Martini's grammar, which was actually made in the 50s of the 17th century, but it was published much later. It circulated as a manuscript. Here you have the text from Oxford, Arte de Lengua Mandarina, the manuscript that belonged to Golius. It is an appendix of the dictionary. You find it at the end, and here you find a very late copy. Unfortunately, Morales lived in the same period as Francisco Barro. They traveled together. They were both at the same time, Francisco Diaz and Morales, in China. But his original text has been lost, so that we have a 1743 copy. And I was very glad during my sabbatical to study those texts in the Vatican. This is from the Casanatense library, and it contains a lot of information, but not only a catechesis, it is also a compilation of word lists, but it has this section, I mentioned it already, with the title Reglas, grammatical rules. So I tried to make a kind of comparison between all those texts. Who is first? What is different? What is maybe the same? How is it presented? And of course, I had to delve into Chinese phonology, and this is a quite complex language according to the view of non-specialists or speakers of other languages than Chinese. It's not the only one, because it has been mentioned already. Otomi also caused a lot of problems, and there are so many Chinese, not the only one, but are languages which have difficult or complex syntactic structures like Nahuatl, and seen from a phonological perspective, there's not so much if you compare it with a language like Otomi or Chinese. So here you find an overview, sometimes alternative readings. Here you can see already this symbol looks like an F, but it is an L, and it's an abbreviation of the last consonant of the Latin word vel, or. So this is used in many texts. It can be this or that. Okay, this can be already interesting. There is a Portuguese tradition, and there is a Spanish tradition, and they made later also texts for Italians. There can be Italian influence and also French adaptations of the romanization system. But here we find two readings, the Portuguese and the Spanish. I will come back later to that. And you see here a lot of diacritics. And those diacritics are generally called tonada. And we would make a big mistake to translate it as a tone diacritic. And that's only a part of the truth, because there are tone diacritics, but there is more than that. You see the puntillo and you see this spiritus asper, and they are combined. And the spiritus asper is the symbol they use for the aspirated stops or occlusives or consonants. And they exist in Chinese. And of course, here we have a mixture of segmental features and suprasegmental features. Tone combined with the dot, that's a symbol for the vowel quality. It has to do with openness and more closed or more opened, with dot or without. You can write it underneath or on top. and together with the aspiration. That's strange because the consonant is here, the aspiration comes at the end. So maybe it was seen like a certain suprasegmental feature of a vowel. And that's not so very strange because the Greek alphabet did not have a consonant written with this letter H. They have a spiritus asper, spiritus lenis. When a vowel is the first letter of a word, it can have a spiritus lenis, and that is more or less the glottal stop if you want. And the spiritus asper is actually the H sound. So you can write this symbol without any consonants or without consonants. You put it on the vowel. So there is clearly here a kind of origin where this it's inspired by the Greek letters. And in Greek you can also combine diacritics. There is a spiritus, and Greek was actually also a tonal language. They have tone difference, irispomenon, all those terms. Oxeia are actually referring not to stress, but to tone differences. So this is what you can find. You can ask yourself, is this original? Is this from Francisco Diaz? No, it is not original. It is also used by Francisco Vago, and it is mainly inspired by the Romanization as it was developed by the Jesuits. Starting, of course, first step with Riccio Ruggieri, and of course, later you have Angelo Cattaneo, and then you have, of course, Trigault, who actually established more or less the Romanization system, the most perfect system for that period. And I'm talking about the year 1626, and this is when Trigault published his text with his system, and this was actually a kind of extension with some discrepancies, some adaptations with some things they needed for the learners who had a Spanish background. And this is actually still more or less the same system. It is not only about vowels. Of course, we have segmental phonology, and we have the consonants and the Chinese syllable, the character. It is difficult to give European concepts to the character, but one character represents, in this case, in the translation, one romanization. It is a syllable, but it is also a morpheme. It can be sometimes a bound morpheme, according to modern terminology. It can be a free morpheme, and it can be a word. And a Chinese syllable, it is different, of course, than the Sulambano, as the word comes from Greek. You take things together, something like that, a vowel and a consonant, you have a syllable. But the Chinese syllable has three parts. An initial, it has a final, and it has a tone. And this was the way they described this Chinese syllable in the East, and without any relation with the European tradition. This has been studied by these authors. But I must also remind that there are a lot of consonants which caused problems for those missionaries. And I just gave here some examples. I don't go into the details. There is less information about that because the text is not complete. We know more from other texts like Francisco Vago, but this fragment does not give all the. But you can imagine you can replace the pinyin, the official modern romanization of Chinese. You can replace it by the early one used by Francisco Diaz. And it is not always that consistent, but you can imagine that it was really quite complete because you need to make the phonological contrast between stops which are aspirated and those which are unaspirated. Sounds like ts and t. You have the same problem for many other indigenous languages like Tarascan and Purépecha. You have a lot of affricates and other comparable problems which are aspirated or not aspirated. It's not so strange for Westerners, of course. Greek made the same distinction, thinking about the letters, the P and the Phi. It's actually the P, and you have the tau and the theta, and you have the kappa and the Chi or the Chi letter. Those distinctions are also based on aspiration, aspirated consonants, stops, occlusives, and those which have, here are more some difficult pronunciations for the Spaniards, of course, and of course for many other strangers. And they have actually a lot of, not only a romanization here developed for education, explanation, or for language instruction, but also articulatory description, how you must use your tongue, the palate, and exactly the articulation of those sounds. And of course, this is the pre-modern period. The use of the vowels, the vowel chords, actually, this is a much later invention in the West. It was a French invention, if I'm not mistaken, from the 18th century. Then they discovered that there is really a clear difference between the unvoiced stops and the voiced ones, and they could show this in the laboratory. In those days, it was not so known, so it's actually, we cannot blame them in that sense. But we find a lot of sometimes very funny articulations, and as I can see, here you find 3. The tone dot is for the vowel quality and aspiration that belongs to this consonant. And if we see the background, the history, and this is not only what I have been thinking or just speculating, but it is also sometimes expressed explicitly in those texts. Also for Vietnamese, you find also a system with tones and diacritics. And there you read often, this is based on Greek, inspired by Greek, where you have the spiritus and the tone, different tones, and you have even the iota subscriptum as a third one, and they can be combined, but the iota didn't have much success in the Chinese studies, but in Vietnamese you find it. The transliteration of Western Jesuits of Vietnamese. Okay, I started to make this reconstruction. We have here an entry in this Jagiel. This Jagiel is a Berlin Krakow manuscript. Then we have the Chinese character, we have pinyin, the meaning, and then we have the vowel. And you can actually see here we have topics which are from the grammar. Vide in arte. Vide in arte, see the grammar. So this dictionary refers to topics which you can find in the grammar. But the grammar is not there. We have just only this fragment. But this was written in the Philippines around 1640, 41. The manuscript is later, as the one of Holius. The Holius one is not original, no, it is very incomplete, it's a very bad one. It has not really a nice calligraphy as other texts have. It is maybe 1/3 does have only characters and still without any translation or transliteration. And in some cases, just one equivalent or neat equivalent, and that's it. But there were more copies, and as you can see, I will come back to this later. Here we have just a selection of topics discussed in the pretérito, the tenses, ille, in Latin, and that's quite normal. If you explain something about demonstratives or the relative pronoun, you usually do that in Latin, because if you have a Spanish text, also in other parts of the world, they can use, in this case, nebrija. And nebrija, I refer not to the Castilian grammar, but of course the Latin grammar. And then they didn't use Spanish, no Portuguese, or maybe no other language, but Latin, in the translations of what you can call grammatical categories or concepts as the quis or ille, illa, illud, vide in arte. So I know already there is something in that arte which has a label demonstrative pronouns. Okay, I can skip this more or less. Then we have, of course, another way we can reconstruct the grammatical descriptions of that early period. Here you have the text which has the title Las Reglas del Formar las Oraciones Activas. And actually here you have a very short grammar. It is only 6-7 pages with 10 rules. And at the end in the colophon you read that it is actually the complete grammar. It's not more than that. So we can actually make this kind of reconstructions. This text also much later, as I said, it is a lot of speculation, but it gives us an idea. Here at the end, you can see this observation. El tiempo enseñará. No servirán estas pocas, las reglas son muy pocas. The rules here, there are very few rules, but will not be sufficient. Of course, we need 100, maybe we need 20, we need maybe 80, I don't know, but it's not okay. Nor will the many rules found in other artists written in this kingdom be sufficient. So there are other texts circulating, but this, according to Morales, was enough. So probably this was another approach how to teach grammar or word order or Chinese to newcomers, the Spanish Dominicans, without really a grammar in the left hand and the dictionary in the other one. There were more texts circulating, which actually were developed with a different point of view. Here you have some examples. Here you have another example. I don't give you the details. As I said, it has a secular content. I'm sick from eating tortillas. And this is just one example. Many texts, as I said, from Karochi and source from Nala. You will never be able to learn how to say, I'm tired, I want to go home. I don't like your voice, and even your food, it stinks, it's not okay. I have seen such translations in these sources. It is very interesting. It has examples with a very secular character, because you can think that for the mission, you need always a translation. For the confession or baptism, of course, you need that as well. But according to the Dominicans, you need also much more. That's conversation. That's how to learn the language with very attractive examples. And in this case, I just show you this one. So I made the reconstruction of based on the references in the dictionary. But of course, also in Francisco Varo, you see reference to the Arte Viejo. It's something, maybe it was a different text, I don't know. But you have something about voice, you have adverbs, tenses. One regla is about the position of the dative, that means word order. There is something about the optative, and now romances. And romance means here a kind of future infinitive. You have genitive of the gerund, and a romance, romance, the participle. So you could ask, oh, here it does not. And again, voice and negation. So these are the topics, and you will miss a lot, of course. And do you think, what's the reason? Maybe, according to their opinion, actually this was sufficient, and the rest can be done because it is a language which can base also on dictionaries which are word-based, character-based, and in that case, you must need also native speakers in order to have. This is my reconstruction. The lost grammar contained the complete one. Noun, comparative, superlative, diminutive, etc. Interjections. This is the whole picture based on those references. It was a complete grammar, and the reglas actually was an attempt to escape this kind of frameworks as a linguistic tool for teaching Chinese. So if you have expectations, the missionaries had their expectations. Today, we need information, we need modern linguistics, and they did not ask the same questions in those days, describing a language. If you compare it, what it has been done today. If you just take a look at a very superficial introduction into Chinese grammar on the internet, everywhere you can imagine, or a course for beginners, what teachers, what they really do need for the beginning, for beginners to learn Chinese. You will not find a complete descriptive handbook of Chinese. No, for beginners, you need some topics. I just made a selection from one of them. It lacks inflection. That's important to know for non-Chinese speakers. It has some word orders. It has some head final language relative clauses. It is discussed in the reglas as well. And you have some observations. The earlier ones really needed some information based on Latin. Bonus, melior, optimus. This is irregular in Latin. So you find a chapter in Varo, the irregular comparatives and superlatives. But in Chinese, it is not regular at all, as in many other languages. And in that case, you can say, this is wrong. No. It is a Western approach. Yes. Is it bad? Probably not, because what they needed is something they knew from school grammar. And, oh, how do you say bonusmeli, the irregular ones? Where can I find it? The irregular ones in Chinese, but then they forgot that Chinese is different. So those who were not familiar with those texts actually had certain bias, except bad text. It's based on the Latin structure. It has, of course, a lot of shortcomings. But if you take a look at the grammar of Varro, you have this huge introduction, complete grammar of Varro, about phonology. Nothing is based on Western sources, sometimes inspired by Greek, but it is not based on any Nebrija-like text. And in the end, you find a lot of pragmatics, or even how to behave when you are invited and are joining dinner with officials, where you must sit, how you must say hello, but also if it's better to be on the left side or the right side, it's behavior, it is etiquette, even much information which you would not expect in a modern grammar when you learn Chinese. Of course, you must know about culture, but this is part of the grammar. So actually, there are a lot of extensions which does not make those texts less interesting, because it will be structured like Latin. And then I'm already talking about 60% is not like Nebrija. It is a lot of information. Okay, maybe, as I said, a very short break, 5 minutes, I think, and then I will make the I will discuss the next topic, lexicography. So maybe the questions at the end, I think, and I take 5 minutes for a brief rest. Okay. Okay, the dictionaries and the lexicographical tradition, and there is I can say already a very interesting corpus. There are texts which are based on Chinese first and then the translation. You have text the other way, starting with Portuguese, and of course later you have also French and Italian, of course, instead of Spanish or Portuguese. You have small text, brief text, you have compendiums, the breve compendio, and you have very large collections of words, so the length can be very different. And I want to pay attention to some texts which were not published yet, and all those texts, not all those texts have a date, or many texts are anonymous, but in some cases we have a prologue, preludio, or something like that. And then we have a lot of information about what the author actually is thinking about, how to compile a grammar. But in other cases, we don't have a title, we don't have a date, we don't know nothing about the author, but I try to make, at the end of my book, an idea of what is maybe we could call a language program, instruction program, together with the grammar and the other texts we have seen it in the entire context of the linguistic documentation and teaching. And also, of course. Okay, the transliteration system is based on Trigo, but there is more in Asia, of course. And I tried also to compare a little bit what happened in Vietnam, but there is more in Chinese. You find here a text from an anonymous dictionary, and you can see here the N for nationalization, and here it's very interesting. You find the numbers 2, 4, and 6. 1, 3, and 5 is missing, but this is just the way Hokkien was actually transcribed by missionaries, and those texts are a bit earlier. And the question in this case, did they know each other? Are they similar or are they different? No, I can already say they are completely different. With one exception, you see the same aspiration mark. And if you compare those transliteration systems with Vietnamese, you can also come to the same conclusion. They are completely different. So why this? It's again about phonology, but yeah, of course, this is from a dictionary. And yeah, you can say there is a linguistic tradition, how the language was taught. And this anonymous dictionary, Vocabulario, has few Chinese characters. It is Hokkien or Southern Min. And before they give the translation, you have indications how to pronounce it. So you have text with very precise diacritics. And this text does not have them in that precise way. Maybe the author didn't want it. Maybe it was not developed yet. Or maybe for teaching practices and they needed something else. So you have a very advanced way with diminutives in Spanish. It's very interesting. It's a huge collection of, let's say, semi-linguistic or terminological, semi-metalinguistic terminology in order to teach the tones in Hokkien. Agudillo, animadillo, decaidilla, entonadillo, and the list does not stop here. And in this dictionary, you find, let's say, a very interesting, some words I could not understand. Quequecillo, I don't have any idea. Maybe someone in the audience can send me a mail, but most are very clear. And we know, of course, more or less the tone system of that language. And with the words we have there, we can also maybe try to reconstruct all those terms because it has to say something. You see also combinations, and the same practice actually occurs in the sources describing Mandarin. So there is a kind of terminological practice here, developed here in very precisely, but maybe sometimes quite vague, but it has a lot of details. If you compare it to the lexicographic tradition of Mandarin Chinese, you don't find this kind of semi-metalinguistic framework, but you find something. There is, of course, in March, Antonio Diaz, the Dominicans describing Mandarin from China, puntiño, fuertecilla, virgulilla, modillo, zumbirillo, it is the little buzzing sound, and the silbidillo. Actually, again, it is apparently a practice among priests to find diminutives for teaching. You have the little buzzing sound and the silbidillo. It has, in this case, a correspondence. It is comparable with what happened in the Philippines, but as I say, those described another language and the grammar and the dictionary are completely different. But manuscripts, some of them were also compiled in the Philippines, as I already tried to say. Okay, trying to have some ideas about the origin, where did they take their information from, how did their adaptations look like. We are trying to have a kind of genealogical approach with parents and sisters and brothers to have a stemma maybe of those traditions. And here the Portuguese play also a very important part. I have given a lot of details in my book, but if we have a dictionary which translates as the holiest one from Chinese into Spanish, it has Spanish as title even, and the text Arte Lengua Mandarin is written in Spanish. But if you take a look, I said already, it's not completed. Many are empty without translation, but there is a lot of Portuguese as well. Nothing like Spanish, particularly the last 30% of the dictionary is Chinese Portuguese. Francisco Barro wrote first his Portuguese Chinese dictionary, and later there was a copy, in this case, Spanish Portuguese. You can imagine that if you start with Antonio Nebrija, the model they used always in the New World, starting with Nebrija's dictionary, Spanish, translating into Latin, they replaced usually, in that case, the Latin column, putting there Mixtec, Zapotec, Purépecha, and here Chinese. So seen from a historical point of view, a methodological point of view, you will get a distorted picture of the Chinese world because Antonio Nebrija was not a missionary. He did not write for a Chinese public, or his examples are based on antiquity. The examples are based on Roman gods. Some tried to give names like Mars and Venus to the Aztec gods, but this is really the the European framework, and then trying to find a translation. So there was not so much place for a real thorough study of the indigenous phenomena, cultural concepts, etc. But we find always a lot of extensions. As Molina in both parts you find already extensions. It's not longer only following Nebriga. What you can see in the collection that translates from Chinese into Spanish, from Zapotec, from Yucatec Maya into Spanish, then you see a complete different picture. It is not based on any Western model. You find here clearly many things linked to the cultures of the Mayas, and there you find much more. And probably they were not used for beginners. It is really for the advanced, and in many cases they were not published. As the Yucatec collection, they are all manuscripts. These texts actually, most of them were not published. And in that case, you can say there's a lot of information based on Chinese. The question is, where did they take their information from? We have this literate person, Joaquin Ko, of course. He was proficient in Mandarin, educated maybe by the Portuguese. He was a Jesuit before, and later he was baptized by the Jesuits, but later he accompanied the Dominican Francisco Diaz. And this maybe could explain that when he made his dictionary outside the city, the periphery of Manila, with Francisco Diaz, maybe with a Portuguese example. The problem is chronology. The Portuguese texts we have are much later, and the earliest one we have, Rogeri Ricci, of course, this text was not diffused among the missionaries I'm talking about. They did not know about the existence. But we have texts, and they are anonymous. One in the Jesuit archive in Rome, and two twin manuscripts at Leiden University. And then I tried to compare those texts with, I started, of course, with the Portuguese translations in Marsh, because maybe you can say, if you have a character, the character means what it means. And if it is a house, you have casa, you have house, you have, in any language, you can translate that maybe. The houses are not always the same in the world, but that's another problem. It can have different names. And why do we call something a maison and later it is a bâtiment, and maybe you have another building which we call a museum? Okay, you have already a problem of hyponymy, hyperonymy, synonymy, how they tried to do something about these problems. The Portuguese, I started with that, and here you have already a list of Portuguese words in Marsh, and here again, also in the Jagiellonski manuscript, which was compiled in Manila with this Chinese assistant or informant, Joaquin Ko, but not so much. It's a huge dictionary, but I have seen here and there also some hybrid forms, the Spanish word with maybe an article in Portuguese, etc. Okay, here in those tables, Francisco Diaz, Vocabulario de Letra China, and then, of course, I had to know if Marsh was really one of those copies linked to Francisco Diaz, to the Jagiellonski collection. And it was positive. It's clearly, and before it is usually said that Jagiellonski is one of the earliest, or maybe the earliest, but I have seen those correspondences, so I can already say that Marsh is the earliest one we have. Not the original autograph, but it is the earliest Diaz book. Okay, we have also later collections. This one is Jagiellonski. This one is from Antonio Diaz. I come back later, and we see some practices which are quite comparable with what happened in the Portuguese tradition. You see here in Portuguese, alcunha, and in the prologue of this dictionary, you see, I have lemmas marked with a little circle here, and this means linaje alcunha, so family names, for instance. And then I already tried, earlier scholars have already said, what does that mean? Is it a phonological thing, this little circle? And I believe that I found the clue now. It is a family name. Okay, that's true if you talk about this dictionary. But if you are going to compare these lemmas with those in the Berlin manuscript, it's not always or seldom the case that those circles correspond. If it has a circle here, In many cases, it doesn't have a circle here, and if it has one here, the other way around, it is not marked, and many names are not family names at all. So it's still, for me, enigmatic what it means here, but there you have a clear explanation. Why do we need this detail? Because the Portuguese did actually the same, not using but it is a question of markedness. If we talk about lemmatization or the tradition, the alcunhas had a prominent place in these texts. Okay, there are some other, just a question of someone in the break. Of course, we have sometimes alternative readings, and in this text we have, in many cases, information, and in the other one, Antonio Diaz, it's even marked with the capital letter F. That means Fokien, Fokien. And this is not a word in Fokien. It is the pronunciation of Mandarin Chinese as it was pronounced in the South. So they marked it with the F, and here it's not marked with the F, but often we find alternative pronunciations or transliterations. Even in one very strange case, so few cases we have here, Hokkien diacritics, which are not from Trigo at all, but as I said, there is a different tradition. And sometimes you find, as I said, Mandarin, as it was pronounced as official Mandarin, from Nanjing, central, not Beijing as today. But we have the pronunciation of Mandarin as it was pronounced in the regions of the South. But also you find here and there some Hokkien, because this was produced in the Philippines, and the question is why? Okay, difficult to answer. To have an idea about the lemmatization procedures of the Portuguese, those texts are later, 1703 or maybe 1680, but according to the catalog and based on indirect indications in the text, it is probably written in the 20s or the 30s. From the 17th century, and there is no real evidence for that. That's a big problem. So a lot of conclusions in my book are speculations. And when you compare the lemmatization, you see sometimes, here's the romanization, so you have a character, the romanization, and then arranged alphabetically with the romanization here. And then you find those columns. Some have just one translation, and others are a bit more complex. Okay, what I tried to do is comparing, here we have just a remark. Varro says here and there, esta partícula significa sacudir, dar golpes, I'm sorry, la cual es muy usada en esta lengua para muchas composiciones. And what do we find in the Portuguese dictionary? Here the entry, ta. Here just one translation, equivalent, and that's it. Ta. Actually, interesting, isn't it? Because this dictionary is not just made like that, giving one equivalent or maybe 2 or 3 words. Sometimes it's much more than that. Okay, if we take a look at the lemmatization of the Berlin manuscript, it's not so much. It's just this. And this is, as I said, the unfinished holiest one. It is even not dar golpes, it's just dar, it stops, it's nothing. And this is actually unfinished, so we cannot blame them. Maybe he had the idea to have something like this later, but it is just a fragment. Okay, there is here an example when I can say the lemmatization pattern of Jagiellonski and the Portuguese on this level, not only Alcunha, but also some have examples. The headwords have romanizations. Here we have only in the examples romanizations without characters. And this makes me actually, yes, I was very curious what this could be. Before I started with that, there is another understudied dictionary without characters. Breve compendio del vocabulario de los compuestos, recently actually identified as a dictionary with the term cabecillas. And these are no Chinese characters, but I made here some correspondence with this huge, large column from the Portuguese section. Roba, roba. Okay, you can say the character means what it means. It produces the same, it can happen independently. But what's here, you find, if you read, take a close look, tirar agua do poço, sacar agua del pozo. There are here sometimes expressions which are actually not really a coincidence. They are probably, it's possible to link them. And as I always say, when I find some correspondences, it's never a copy that you see the whole picture coming back in another text. But there are here very, sound the bonzus here, there's the bonzus here, you find enfadar with the same piao here, and enfadar, and then importunar, enfadar, enfadar. So it is actually not an exception, and this has to be researched still, because there is much more, and I did just a very superficial look. I had a superficial look. Okay, I can skip here some more examples and show you some more details. And it was really sometimes surprising that we have here again Marsh, the Holy manuscript. This one is from the Portuguese collection, and it was a real problem to have this I don't pronounce it very nice, I'm sure about it, with different accents. They have different transliterations in Portuguese and in Spanish. And what do we find here in the March collection? The first here is like Portuguese, and the second is the way the Spaniards and how it was used in the Dominican context. So probably there is a kind of influence maybe had the Portuguese example, and that explains why we have this Portuguese transliteration first and then the second one. Sometimes we have alternative spellings, but here you have those, we have here, okay, the same. Hijo, chiquito, filho, menino. And here you have ja, you have here some translations. And we find here in Latin, et. So this is Latin. What do we have here? So you must have a microscopical view. Here we have et, first in Latin, and then the translation. And I've found much more. I have to do still a lot of research. But this is actually one of those reasons that we can say we can link those texts with Portuguese dictionaries. And the examples are really sometimes in the detail. Aspiration mark, tone, aspiration mark, as in Portuguese. In Marsh, you find this one. Jagiellonski, you find actually another order of those diacritics. And of course, this does not mean directly that this author has not seen the Portuguese one. Those accents can vary. Sometimes you find them in different places, sometimes here on top of the consonant, and that can vary. But here again, some discrepancies are found in both Portuguese and in Marsh, and not in Jagiellonski. So probably when I've seen also this grammar with those alternative readings, this was earlier, and still the Portuguese had great influence. And of course, later, this is something we can also research later. This is Brollo. Many entries are actually also have some coincidences or same comparable lemmatization and translations. Okay, we can study those texts only from the point of view of the history of Chinese, dialectology, the history of linguistics, but there is also Spanish, of course. And just a very brief remark, those texts are very interesting and not studied yet, it's understudied. There are loanwords from Nahuatl, the language native, one of the languages, indigenous language of Latin America. There are Tagalog borrowings in those translations, so this is also very interesting. I don't give all the details, you can find them in this book. I have here more about very strange or maybe exotic uses of some words which exist in Portuguese or in Spanish, but not in standard language, as cagueteando, caguete, alcagote, alguetear, alcobetejar. Actually, it is a very interesting source also if you want to study Spanish. And I will close very briefly with the final one. It's Antonio Diaz. I said Nebrija played a role as an example, as a model. Other texts which translate from Chinese into Spanish are probably also inspired by the native tradition, but we do not know. It has to be researched. But in other cases, Antonio Diaz tells us explicitly that he made this dictionary, cuyo primer autor fue Francisco Diaz. The first author was Francisco. This author has the name Antonio Diaz, and it is based on Chinese dictionaries. And he also mentions 3 of them. So here we have actually a different approach. It's not Western lexicography translating into Spanish. We have here an author who mentions also the Chinese tradition. Again, the prologue with the tones, with many discrepancies as well. I translated and edited also this prologue. It has not been published in English because Klaproth already studied it a long time, centuries ago. Okay, he's explaining the system of how some rhyme dictionaries were constructed, not all of them. There's a great variety of large lexicographical tradition in China. One of them is the system of Fangche. That means you have, for instance, the syllable, and how do you explain the explanation? You give the character, and then you give a second one with the same initial, and then the third one is another word which has the same final. And in that case, you have 3 symbols. So you can maybe think about the word in to be, and then you give after that to buy. Then you have the first initial, the letter B. And if you have this E, you want to know how to pronounce that, you give a final word from English which has an ending in E. Me, that's a word like me, or some example, or the C. So this is the way, actually, he explains this, how this works. But it is important that he also mentions Chinese sources, and research still needed. How much is taken from that, with which kind of expressions, and it is still something we hope to see in the future. Okay, we have grammars. We have. I will finalize this. There's one. Okay, I can skip this again. Morales wrote much more than only this short chapter about the rules. With Paolo de Troya, I finished last week a paper with a translation of the adagios. This means the missionaries did not need only dictionaries and grammars. They needed, as I say, a kind of repertoire in order to say, I'm sick, I don't like this tortilla. This is colloquial speech, but they must also show, according to their opinion, that they have a very literate background. This means it is very nice if you have adagios, proverbs, in many cases taken from the Bible, taken from European collections sometimes, but often, as you can see, mentira dice el China, there are Chinese proverbs, Confucius-based or inspired proverbs, and you can see there is a context, quien lengua aromará. Those kind of proverbs were also important in the instruction of Chinese. And the Chinese component here is very important. And this is a forthcoming article not in my book, but I already announced there that there are many different tools in order to learn Chinese. So for me, this is one of the final conclusions, and I'm not talking here about myself because it's obvious. It is never boring. It is even not work. I'm curious and I want to know what happened. And I'm so sad that many things will never be solved. But I'm talking here for them, Morales, I'm convinced he never say this, but it was fun for him. It was a profession. Teaching must be attractive. So give something which is from the Chinese proverbs, or give not so many rules, you don't need them, but you have a lot of, you need for reading skills, a specific dictionary in the characters. Others do not have them for the beginners. So it's actually, you cannot talk really about the educational program as it was developed by the Jesuits, because there we have really texts about how to teach Chinese in detail, where you have to start, where you have to follow, and this is very interesting, but the Dominicans do not have such text. But if you put all the pieces together, also Baro gives a lot of information in his prologue, what kind of linguistic variety you must learn, okay, the official one, but also the colloquial style. You must be able to read, but first you don't need the characters because that's too complicated, and you have other tools, and you need to listen to the people and also to really understand or be able or proficient in colloquial speech. But also I'm convinced that those authors had really fun, because if you see it as a personal testimony of how they were thinking that teaching of Chinese was important. Sometimes it was maybe boring, and they started to make some illustrations. If the characters were really too difficult or the tones too difficult to pronounce, maybe it was a bit boring, but I'm just kidding. This is just by coincidence. You find it in some manuscripts as well. Why do I show? They are actually like letters. They often, even the printed versions of Latin American grammars, you find sometimes observations about the language we never would publish today. We do not say in a PhD, I didn't understand a word of that. I'm sorry, it's too difficult, I'm too old. But you can study it as a historical document. And this is the context. And they started to make maybe pictures when it was too complicated. Okay, again, the research questions. The role played by Western manuscript dictionaries in the history of Chinese linguistics. Okay, you can study them for Chinese linguistics. It is material about the varieties, spoken varieties, etc. Different systems. I tried to explain a little bit about how it worked between the Portuguese and the Dominicans, and the lemma arrangement and the interaction. And we have seen that there is an interaction. Until how far, it is not a clear copy, but we find a lot of discrepancies, but also many things which are quite similar. This has to be researched. We have really further research is needed. And then we have the junction between grammars. All those questions come from the project. They are really linked because we have this example with references to the grammar in the dictionary of Berlin. So we can also try to visualize this with overlaps, with differences. The proportion is maybe not okay, but it gives us an idea. Chronological, this reconstruction, because the Portuguese texts, many of them are later, but there are indications that they were earlier. Then we have an overlap. Barolo has maybe some, there's an overlap between these, and here we have something which Portuguese, we compare that, we can all compare them, not only as I did it as a superficial first step, but we need quantitative statistics, also modern technology, in order to really establish the connections between them and trying to digitize all those lemmas, and that you can search and find exactly the place and author and translations with character, etc., etc. So my book is just beginning, is to sketch a draft, and most chapters end with the observation. Much further research is needed. References, and merci de votre attention.